Thank you. Thank you for the introduction. I always sound way better when introduced. At some point, I had a band, and the comment that I loved the most whenever we played was someone said, "You guys are way better than you sound," which I was not sure what they meant. But okay, so thank you very much. I changed the title just a tiny bit, but I'd like to share with you my work on soccer chants, fandom, and its intersections with masculinity and a concept of that I'll address called de-individuation. Mark, good to see you. Before I start, I am very happy to be here for many reasons. I have met Joshua a couple of years ago, and we worked together. He helped us in collaborating with this book that we made. And there's also Luis here, whose dissertation is going to be the groundbreaking work in this field. I'm super excited. I've told Luis 1,000 times that had I seen this coming before, when I was a grad student, this would have been my grad school project for like my dissertation, because it's such a fantastic topic. So I'm very happy. I'm looking forward to seeing that. Anyway, so without further ado, in local Argentine soccer matches, one can find anywhere between 200 to 50,000 people chanting together, accompanied by large ensembles of percussion and brass instruments for an entire 90-minute match. Unlike most sporting events in the United States, these are not pre-programmed musical interventions or choreographed calls from action from a PA system, but unscripted, impromptu, and unstructured participation triggered by spectators. Argentines are well known for being some of the most musically oriented fan bases in the sport, and their chants are often imitated worldwide. When I say musically oriented, I mean the repertoire of songs that any one team can have ranges all the way to like 70, 90 songs, and they're very creative in the sense that they're constantly producing new ones. That's what I mean here by musically oriented. In this opening example, the fans of San Lorenzo de Almagro will take the vocal melody of a song called Amor Clasificado by Rodrigo, a beloved figure of the Cuarteto Cordobés genre in Argentina. Here's Rodrigo's song, and for those of you that don't remember this, before Craigslist and all those things, people used to put ads on the newspapers, and you did find those kind of love calls, like, I saw you on the bus, you were wearing a red shirt, and maybe you recognize me. Of course, not in big cities, but in a place like Providence, you would encounter that, perhaps in a student newspaper or something. So this is talking about that. He's putting a love ad looking for love. So the melody, if you think about soccer chants, usually people think, oh yeah, or something like that. Oh, ha, 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 ha. But here you have like a really extended melody, right? With some little nice twists. So here's the San Lorenzo fans singing this with their own lyrics. The fans' passionate singing begins by stating the core values that keeps them coming to the stadium. They have aguante, which translates into endurance or stamina, an important concept that I will address later in this paper, or you can ask Luis about. And because of that, they are different from their main rivals, the team Huracan, who is not only accused of being informants of the police, which is pretty bad when you're coming from a former dictatorship in the 1970s and 80s, but also of being putos. This word, a derogatory term for male homosexual, is implying cowardice and lacking aguante. The fans declare their unwavering support in the face of adversity, en las buenas y en las malas, good times and bad times, and their commitment to follow their team a donde quiera que vayan, wherever you go. Finally, two key signs of identity close the chant, a reference to the home neighborhood, Boedo, and the colors of the team, deep red and blue. Sorry, blue and deep red. The work of Daniel Guignazú, Reinhard Hopies, and Guido Brink has paid particular attention to the semiotic density of chants that originate in familiar melodies and are giving altered or new words. These studies show how using mass-mediated popular music as source for melodic materials, such in this case Rodrigo's original tune, creates a layer of meaning, some sort of snowball effect charged with history, and gives continued existence to songs that might have otherwise faded from the public's imagination. In a different academic vein, Eduardo Archetti, Pablo Alabarces, and Jose Garriga, among others, have brought into the foreground the role that Argentine soccer plays in shaping local identity, rivalries, particular types of masculinities, and all of these framed by race and nation. Their engagements with chant has mostly focused on lyrics and their role in the discursive constructions of these aspects. Both avenues of exploration, tracing the history of the melodies or doing discursive analysis of chant lyrics, have left unexplored how these chants become meaningful beyond text and beyond genealogy. I'm going to open this just to be sure I can see what's happening back there. In this paper, I propose that ethnomusicology can significantly contribute to the study of chants by exploring the specific potentials that participatory moving and sounding in synchrony have when people assemble. What I suggest is to understand soccer chants as a plural performative social space that does not just reflect, but gives meaning to the practices of aguante, a key symbol among soccer fans central in the construction of an ideal masculinity. By producing and reproducing ideas about fandom, group identity, and manhood, chanting as collective action acts as a type of mass ritual through repetitive and redundant performances, eliciting peer group validation of behaviors that can be homophobic, racist, and violent. Pablo Alabarces and the ethnographic work of Garriga, Moreira, Bundio, and others have convincingly argued that the behaviors of devoted fans in Argentina, those who follow and support dutifully their team, needs to be understood under the logic of aguante. Aguante functions as an honor code, as a prestige system that distinguishes and identifies fans through the values of courage, bravado, stoicism, and in some cases, fearlessness in physical confrontation. There are multiple signs that are interpreted as demonstrations of having aguante and therefore being a true fan. First, you have to alentar siempre. You have to be willing to support the team, jump and chant throughout entire soccer matches, even in the face of adversity. So routine matches are treated as if every moment was crucial and transcendental, and bad weather or unfavorable team results need to be endured. So the idea that you stop chanting because you're discouraged because the team is losing is contrary to aguante. That's when you have to chant the most. Second, you have to ir a todos lados, showing up to all the matches, no matter the team's performance or the time or place of the match. Actually, in stadiums, people are sometimes proud of skipping school or avoiding work because they're showing their commitment, their true aguante in following the teams. Especially valued is following the teams in their away games and enduring long and uncomfortable trips. Finally, for some of the fans, having aguante has to ultimately be demonstrated by enduring confrontation, whether withstanding the chants and insults of opposing fans, or ultimately standing your ground during fights. The result of physical combat is often irrelevant. What matters is having endured, pararse, no correr, that means stand your ground and not run. Fans that share this belief are certainly a minority, but they tend to have the strongest leadership internally, one they earn precisely through the prestige gained by showing aguante. This last factor is important, since the discourse of aguante establishes a framework for meaning that marks as positive both actions and values that do not correspond to the hegemonic understandings of violence. Where the majority of Argentine society, especially in the media, sees groups of fundamentally senseless, violent individuals, fans have a transactional prestige in place, violence that expresses a legitimate way of showing belonging to a group and earning your place within it. And it is through moving and sounding in synchrony, or at least I argue, that this sense of belonging is most commonly experienced. So in this paper, I use the word chant to describe all sorts of things that I would say is collectively synchronized utterances that range from liminal speech to more conventional songs. So on one side, you have things that have little variation in tone, reduced intervallic range, and perhaps unremarkable rhythms. An example of this would be calling the team's name, Boca, 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 or asserting the historical dominance over another team by calling them our sons, hijos nuestros. So that's almost on the side of speech. But then on the opposite side of the spectrum, there's chants that involve entire verses, bridges, chorus, with complete new lyrics, distinct melodic contour, and distinguishable rhythmic features, like the one we saw earlier, or this one. Right. The attention to the purely verbal component of terrace chanting has led to gaps in our understanding of the practice precisely as not speech. As a sonic practice and a social activity, chanting soccer is a highly participatory performance. Unlike presentational-oriented practices, the main goal in soccer chanting is not quality of performance, but participation, sounding and moving together in synchrony. In the stadium, there is no distinction between artist and audience, but instead participants and potential participants. Within those who come to the stadium, there are clear roles, both in terms of fandom, of music making, and the internal hierarchies of the fan base. Significantly, these roles point at different amounts of interest in chanting, in musicking, or the financial rewards that might result from leadership positions among fans, and not necessarily to the degrees of devotion of the team, meaning some of the leaders actually are not so much of big fans as some others that are not leaders. What in English might be grouped as fans involves a nuanced series of words in Argentina. People that regularly attend matches and display multiple signs of aguante identify themselves as hinchas or aficionados. Among them, there's the hinchada militante, the militant fans, who pride themselves on attending every match regardless of weather or the team's performance. Their usual place is behind one of the goals where, always standing, they will chant throughout the whole match. The most important subgroup among these militant fans often call themselves la barra, the term I will use here, or la hinchada, la banda, los pibes, la pandilla. It really varies depending on the team. In Europe, they might be called the ultras. In Argentine media has most prominently called them barras bravas, given their frequent reliance on physical violence. But this is a game most barras actually dislike. The barras of almost all teams in Argentina have some sort of relationship with club executives, even coaching staff and players. It is in virtue of this clientelistic network that they receive tickets, engage in monetary support for traveling, and are allowed access to the stadium with objects such as drums, trumpets, trombones, giant banners, and even fireworks that are usually prohibited to regular audiences. When I would go to the stadium, I normally arrive early to see what's happening and perhaps meet some people. And sometimes there's nothing happening, so I carry a book, like a good, proud nerd. But I frequently found resistance from me entering with a book. They were like, what are you going to do with that? Are you going to burn it? It's like, no, I'm going to read it. But so it's surprising that someone like me, couldn't enter a book, but the barras can enter all of this stuff, and that has to do with their relationship with the clubs, with the police, etc. So here's some examples of the things you would enter to the stadium that I was describing here. This is the banners. This is right before the match starts. This is Ferro, the team, Ferrocarril Oriente. This is Independiente. They're setting up the banners before the match. And people don't actually sit in that area because I know that's where the core fans will sit. The most important subgroup among the, I've read that. Internally, these barras have leaders, or capos, or jefes, and followers, called also tropa, or seguidores. So in this case, are the two particular leaders that are the most, perhaps, notorious or infamous leaders of Boca Juniors. The one on the left, actually, is no longer admitted in the the stadium for like the third time, I think, in his life. He's been banned, this time apparently for good. And then here's some of the leaders and followers in this particular group. I never understood really who was the leader, but I knew that in general they would be the people in charge and asking me, hey, don't take pictures of our faces, et cetera, et cetera. And here, again, you have leaders at the bottom and followers at the top. This was, to me, you know, I grew up in South America and I would go to the stadium, but I never understood really the social internal dynamics. And going to the stadium, I understood that not anybody can just simply stand there. It's not like, oh, I feel really, no, there's a hierarchy there. And some of the people will be in charge of security. They're actually not even looking at the match. If you look at the bottom, they're either rousing people or checking that nothing goes on without them, you know, knowing. Things like drug sales or robbing is completely like that should not happen, and they are in charge of it. Mostly because, you know, if there's drug selling, they do it. They don't, you know, and violence is completely out of the question. If there's internal disputes, this might also be a way of protecting the leaders. Leadership is determined not based on the love for the team, but through demonstrations of aguante, often through participating in physical altercations, stealing banners from other teams, and showing courage and a strong hand. Leaders benefit from increased prestige, neighborhood recognition, and the significant profits from endeavors almost always outside the law, such as resale of tickets, sales of pirate merchandise around the stadium, charging for public parking during matches, or even drug sales. Diplomatic and intimidating skills are also valued, since these capos will frequently end up negotiating with club executives and the police, as well as mediating among the rest of the barras to organize them, diffuse them, and escalate their reactions, so that they are exceptionally talented at reading social clues to determine when it's a good moment for a compliment, a threat, or physical violence. In fact, the police relies on this a lot. They trust the barras to be able to control their people. And the police, the last thing they want to be is in the middle of 40,000 people. They want, you know, the internal control is actually a good thing for them. At the core of all synchronized sounding in the stadium comes from the middle of the barras. The core of all synchronized sounding in the stadium comes from the middle of where the barras are located. There, one finds the central and most ubiquitous instrument of Argentine soccer stadiums, the bombo con platillo. Here are some examples. This bass drum with a cymbal tend to have a diameter from about 22 to 24 inches. The drum is usually decorated with colors and emblems of the team, as well as the name of the barras, La Gloriosa Buteler, Los Borrachos del Tablón, etc. A redoblante, the snare drum, and a repique, the name given to the repinique Brazilian drum, are also staples. So here in the middle, you have a snare drum. To the left, you have a zurdo drum and a repique or repinique. In matches of Independiente and Avellaneda, one of the 5 largest teams in Argentina, I counted 22 bombos, 5 zurdos, and 4 snare drums at the core of the group. For Atlanta, a small 3rd division team, there were 5 bombos, a snare drum, and a repique. Other instruments appear in different bands, including scrapers, tambourines, cowbells, whistles, agogo bells, etc. There's a lot of influence from samba-sounding batuque from Brazil. Most clubs have at least 3 trumpet players, although a large team like Boca Juniors has around 15. Trombones are a fairly common addition, and at least a couple of the teams also use euphoniums. While bombo players come exclusively from the ranks of the militant fans, it is not uncommon to find hired brass players from other outside teams, although nobody's like advocating for their team, they're just there for the gig, literally. The overall coordination of chanting, and ultimately of what and when the band of instruments will be playing, often, but not always, falls to one of the leaders or capos of the barras. The leader will give verbal and visual cues to the head of the bombos to coordinate new chants, or might simply start and expect the band to follow promptly. The main chant spreads through other vociferous barras who, like the leader, stand on top of the multiple anti-human crushed metal bars. So here's an example of a chant and how the internal dynamic is working. In this particular case, this gentleman is actually one of the leaders. He was the one that gave me authorization to record this. And you'll see the gentleman here with the keys. He's actually security. He's actually there, you know, he's a fan, but he's also there for security purposes. So he's constantly looking at me like, why are you doing this? He's not very happy about that. But he had watched the whole first half of the game, just watched it, and was kind of he didn't like the lack of synchronization. The sense of synchronization is very wide, but there's a point where it doesn't feel tight. So he just simply started grabbing the drum himself and taking it on his own hands. Here we go. fans use flags and ropes to maintain equilibrium and, surprisingly, sometimes miss large portions of the match, taking instead the role of crowd rousers, helping spread the chants, exciting the crowds, and often enough demanding aggressively for everybody to be singing and supporting the team. This reminds me of when I was little, playing soccer, always felt like the keeper didn't do much, and you always wanted to go run, like try to score or do something. And then you slowly learn that's your role, that's what you do, and you perhaps miss a lot of the good action, but that's what you occupy. The fans also have the sense of this is what you do. You might miss the match, but this is how we participate in the team. As expected, the beginning and endings of performances are always feathered. Sometimes a chant might fail or have a false start. People might not be ready to shift, or the rousers might have botched their attempt to change the chant. But once they do, they spread quite quickly among thousands of people. So here's one of the situations where the chant is slowly getting into place. And the second time the chant is kind of settled, the brass instruments start. And one of the brass instruments in this particular group is one of the few that I met that was actually a music student in a music department. And one of the ways you could tell is because he would start to try to do like flourishy things. He would go like do higher octaves and do thirds and be fancy. So this is one of the rousers that rarely watches the match. And here they're standing on the para avalanchas. So here's the chant beginning. Successful chanting involves a very clear set of parameters. Like any music making, there's things that people consider successful. Volume and a wide sense of synchrony among the largest number of participants are valued highly. When the crowd is rhythmically out of sync, beyond what is usually acceptable, snare drums or repique drums will often play louder and with a piercing tone and usually steady beat, try to bring the pulse to a wide but in sync state. Overall, cleverness in lyrics is appreciated. The vocal style used for singing emphasizes a round tone, with sound placed in the back of the head, with very little chest or throat involved, allowing for prolonged and unamplified singing throughout the game. I had a friend that taught middle school, and she was really annoyed that all her students in class would sing with this tone, because they learned to sing in the stadium, so they sing like this. And she's like super annoying, because they sing, Ríe, decime que se siente. So if you imagine, I know Mary had a little lamb, like it doesn't work. So middle school teachers hate it. For chants with clear melodic contours, singing is expected to have a wide tuning, and the high density of texture and timbre provides ideal cloaking of individuals contributing to that might not be close to the expected pitches. Now, in a university where Joshua teaches, I'm sure people understand this concept of wide tuning and texture so that there's a cloaking effect among multiple players. Nobody will criticize, like Sikus, nobody will criticize a neighboring fan for being out of tune. Since, like Thomas Turino points out for participatory performances, the etiquette of and quality of sociality is granted priority over the quality of sound. However, not chanting or chanting with little energy are interpreted as signs of not being a true fan. A final aspect of chanting involves, as you might have noticed, body movement. Participatory sounding and moving in synchrony is the ultimate desired goal. The most common gesture involves a diagonal extended arm towards the sky with back and forth movement of the forearm and a fairly loose wrist. Sometimes both arms might do this as well. Jumping up and down in pogo fashion is also fairly common, and it sometimes leads to sideways bumping, particularly after goals. One of my, I'm going to skip this one for a moment. One of my strategies was to usually get closer or stand nearby people that I thought were smaller than me in general because of that sideways movement. They're all younger, and perhaps less frail, and I was not ready to fall. So if you see the videos when I'm actually jumping, this is not one of my videos, but when I'm actually jumping, it's always like really next to like young people, very young, like like in their 13s, 14s. So I was like, I can take these people. So let's take a look. might have noticed that it's quite crowded here, but the stadium is not full at all. And this happens on purpose. Like people get crowded on the same spot. Like when you go to a rock concert, people are like bunched up. They don't take advantage of the whole thing. There's an aspect of the bodies being close. William McNeill has shown how regular, repetitive, collective expressions, such as coordinated rhythmic movement, creates a kind of muscular bonding that endows groups with strong senses of solidarity. You can think about the army, for example. In a parallel way, the ritual-like practice of moving and sounding together in the stadium is a powerful source of emotion, and added to sounding together becomes a crucial factor in producing a collective and embodied sense of masculinity that frequently transcends the confines of the stadium. While I have focused so far in explaining how sounding and moving in synchrony connects fans intimately, one cannot assume that these connections are necessarily positive. Chanting in the Argentine soccer stadium is a practice that incites intense feelings of social cohesion, belonging, and bonding. And I've thought about this, and I think that it's not just the happy moments, but I think specifically the sad moments, the losing moments, the tragic moments of the team's history that bonds more strongly. Precisely because of this, it also becomes a space for projecting collective anxieties and performing what Suarez Orozco has called a structural scapegoating of the other. Here is a blatantly intolerant chant heard on the stands. The words negro and puto are used to sonically attack the adversaries, creating discriminatory discursive regimes. As the fans chant, their intensity increases in these two words. And if, for the next examples, pay attention as I play that, whenever you see one of these words, there's actually an accent being sung. They give an accent that underlines the importance of those words that are being sung. In Argentina, the word negro works as an indexical cluster that points to darker skin color, to indigeneity, associated particularly with migrants, and to low socioeconomic status. The mention here of neighboring Bolivia and Paraguay is related to the migrants from these countries who often occupy precarious sectors of society and frequently are blamed for increasing social and economic problems. Buenos Aires has large sectors of the population that identify as being white and of European descent, and they see in darker skin tones a dangerous others with less claims to the nation. The use of the word negro, which is non-generic for non-whites, not necessarily what you would find in the US, has functioned both as a term of endearment and as an index of poverty, of immigration, lower class, poor manners, and ultimately a counter-race, in opposition to that white middle class. Those who use it often argue that there's no racial component involved in utterance, but instead has to do with behavior that they associate with bad taste, with vulgarity, and bad attitude. However, like the word puto, race, class, and gender are often inseparable in practice from judgments and hierarchies of taste and claims of appropriateness. The words are read and pronounced in an accusatory manner. They're used to demean, to stigmatize, and to reduce the recipients. And they both become meaningful within a history of racism and sexual discrimination. While racist and anti-Semitic chants, which I have not included, but they are also around, have gradually but relatively efficiently made it out of the stadiums, contemporary chants often involve sonic attacks to the opposing teams, players, and fans that are androcentric, heteronormative, and homophobic, as you might have noticed throughout the examples of this presentation. You know, like things like calling someone hijos nuestros, there's some sort of history behind that, right? With few exceptions, soccer authorities have not made strong commitments to eradicate these kinds of attacks. Here's some examples. Oops. I'll go back. This kind of led to, this is how the project really started, because I knew a lot of Argentines. I had spent time doing my experimental music project, working with avant-gardes and composers, and especially of the older generation. And I really hadn't encountered vocal manifestations of homophobia or anything like that in Argentina. In fact, I actually felt that Argentina was quite progressive. Their gender laws are quite more progressive than the US. Same-sex marriage has been around since the 90s, early 2000s. There were gender laws that allowed you to identify for your gender without having to go to medical exams or things like that we have here. So I was kind of struck. Chanting in massive numbers allows for the public utterances of expressions, slurs, profanities, and violent threats that most people might refrain to use individually. But voicing ideas about sexuality and violence in a stadium is not the same as believing them. As Judith Butler argues, to act in concert does not mean to act in conformity. Like in other music-making contests, there are aspects of what fans do that resemble role-playing. And I'm thinking here, for instance, heavy metal concerts. Inside the stadium, many are expected to play the part of fans, to scream, to curse at referees, and physically enact fandom and release aggression that would not be made public otherwise, making it a cathartic experience. I'm kind of thinking of like that sweet, loving friend that you have that when they're in the heavy metal concert, they're pushing people and pogoing, and you're like, and then they're like, yeah, they're loving people, but in that space, you're like, what is happening? And there's a role-playing aspect to this. The genuine excitement that often results from this bonding experiences that are happening on the stadium might create a state of cognitive dissonance, given the inconsistency of the actions and words in relation to the beliefs of the majority of the fans. Leon Festinger in 1957 indicated the possibility of ways to, or the possible ways to cope with cognitive dissonance, including reducing the importance of the behavior or changing your own beliefs slowly to correspond to that behavior. For the former, one could argue that militant fans often dismiss criticism of violent or homophobic or racist language on arguments of intentionality. We didn't mean it like that, right? Like, we don't mean it like that, and which has been used in the US and Mexico for the Mexican chant when the soccer kick happens. They're singing the puto word again. And this has been used as an argument. Oh, that's not how we mean it. While the latter might be more the case among the barras, where violence actually does take place. Banners and bombo drums do get stolen, and sometimes chanting, "We are going to kill you," ceases to be a figurative and becomes literal language. There have been 281 soccer-related deaths in Argentina between 1924 and 2014, and even 103 of them happened since 1979. In other words, it is possible that repeated framing as positive the results of violent and transgressive actions in certain controlled environments can transcend such contexts and alter one's habits, making it feasible to extend these practices outside their original figurative frame. Chants, constantly repeated in what seems like a mundane activity, erode notions that people might hold right. Like Johnson and Clunan in their study of popular music, I suggest that the relationship here between music and violence, symbolic or physical, is not necessarily or simply one of direct causality. I'm not saying music causes violence. Causality in this particular case is much more complex, but what I do want to point out is that when physical violence does erupt, having experienced this repertoire of assembled bodies and sounding together in synchrony frames the interpretations of those actions in a way that is problematic. In the stadium, as in many other instances of large gatherings of people, usual individual behavior is replaced by collective states of disinhibition and increased susceptibility to crowd behaviors, the so-called mob mentality. Are there a lot of fraternities and sororities at Brown? Yeah. So you've seen this kind of behavior where they would not do it alone, but when they're in groups, like, what did you just do? That kind of situation. For this shift to take place and become prevalent, people must reach a state of reduced self-awareness and a reduced concern for social evaluation that psychologists have called de-individuation. De-individuated subjects are more likely to ignore the restraints against aggressive behavior or activities that are ordinarily maintained by internalized norms and the prospect of negative social sanctions. Felix Zimbardo has suggested that different input variables, anonymity, diffused responsibility, noise arousal, chanting, and fatigue can lead to de-individuation. Anonymity, chanting, diffuse responsibility, fatigue, noise arousal. Since these conditions can be easily found in stadiums, research in group violence and football hooliganism has frequently relied on theories of de-individuation. However, current scholarship has not yet examined how participatory chanting is, I believe, next only to the anonymity granted by being in a large number of people present in the stadium, nobody really knows who you are, a central contributor to the conditions of arousal, to the sense of belonging, to the decreased self-awareness, to the recognition of anonymity, to diffuse responsibility and lack of accountability. So I'm saying that these chants are central contributors to these factors. The characteristics that describe music making driven by a participatory ethos are in unique alignment with these parameters. Sonic conditions in the stadium contribute to a reduced self-awareness. While it would be at first strange to think about participatory music making diffusing responsibility or allowing lack of accountability, that is precisely some of the qualities that are able to emerge in chanting, where the individual voices are downplayed and masked through thick textures, through wide tunings and wide synchrony. Not one person is responsible on the success or failure of a chant, on its beginning or in its end. The heightened levels of arousal instigated by sounding and moving together in synchrony as a large group involve awareness on how other participants are doing in their involvement of their activity, emphasizes sense of group belonging. What I'm arguing here should come as not surprise. While participatory music making increases the sense of belonging to a group, it can also contribute to the de-individuation of the participants. The sonic conditions fostered by participatory music making become fertile ground for both particular de-individuated states and shared experiences akin to what Victor Turner called communitas, a sense of felt by a plurality of people without boundaries, a group pleasure in sharing a common experience. Now, much more than simply delivery of lyrics or sharing a specific repertoire for sounding and moving, I believe this process becomes an important embodied practice, the basis for powerful shared and intimate social connections and shared collective interpretations. And these connections and interpretations are the bedrock for a kind of hypermasculinity that is both performed and reproduced in the stadium through transgressive words, actions, and representations of others. The sonic conditions foster a sense of communitas, and this sense of sharedness and its lived joyful and feeling experience through stadium fandom might significantly reduce individuals' participants' willingness or capacity to grasp how problematic, hurtful, discriminatory, or dehumanizing their actions can be. In other words, there's a disconnect between how happy or sad you feel or how feelingful the experience is and you being able to problematize what is it that you're doing. This same understanding can, of course, be expanded to other situations where gathered crowds might engage in unthinkable or taboo individual behaviors. As a sonic practice in Argentina, chanting like this does not only occur in soccer stadiums or sporting events. Its presence is also notable at political rallies and street protests, where it plays a similar function in unifying groups and collective experiences. And here I'm thinking of things like, lock her up or Jews will not replace us, which we have unfortunately experienced in recent years, or at least have received more attention in recent years. And due to a heavily mass-mediated soccer scene, Argentine chants currently have significant transnational circulation. This study, I hope, sheds important light on how chanting functions as a type of collection action akin to mass ritual, and how synchronized sounding and moving in public spaces, specifically in the stadium, can potentially relate to similar collective performances in political rallies, religious activities, and protest movements. Thank you.